Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Tuvas, and today I'm going to be building my very first FPV quadcopter. For those unacquainted with my channel, my content is normally gaming oriented with a focus on tutorials for games I happen to be enjoying at the time. For example, I've produced a number of gameplay and tutorial videos for the very fun but very complicated DCS World, a military plane sim. FPV flying has very similar elements that can carry over from DCS. However, that's not to say that it's going to be a breeze. I mean, sure, I know the basics of flying a helicopter in DCS. I can transport cargo in a Huey all day. But does that mean I have what it takes to split S over some trees, Matty flip through a gap, and combo into a Vanny roll Rubik's Cube within the confines of my own backyard? Probably not. But luckily there is at least one similarity between DCS and FPV flying that will get me to that point. Simulators. Generally speaking, simulators exist to give prospective pilots or even non-pilots a chance to get their feet wet without the risk of crashing a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Not to mention the risk of, dying. Now, while the mortality risk is many times lessened for FPV flying, there is still a very real monetary risk for anyone looking to fly quadcopters, especially for those who have built one on their own dime and time. That's where games like Liftoff and Drone Racing League Simulator come in. These are two simulators that I've been using to prepare myself for flying the real thing, and they cost $20 and $10 respectively, at least at the time of this recording. Links in the description below. Now, why am I doing this? Well, personally, I've always had a fascination for flight. Not so much for the history and how it came to be, but for the challenge held within and the payoff of being amongst the clouds when you finally get into the skies. Now, that said, I'm not going to be hopping into a real AV-8B Harrier II night attack VTOL aircraft anytime soon. I mean, it is very unlikely that I'll be going from flying a military plane in a sim to flying one in real life. But FPV flying, now that is a different story. I can spend hours flying on my computer in Liftoff or DRL sim practicing freestyle or improving my race lines through gates, and then with my very own quadcopter in hand, head outside and pull it off for real. That right there is something unique. And that's why I'm here today. And I wanted to share that experience with you. Now you're probably looking at what's in front of us and saying, hey Tuvas, why don't you try going for a kind of a smaller, safer build that has like prop guards so you don't risk bumping into things and breaking things while you're flying around for the first time? Well, I tried. Okay, yeah, looks like that'll fit. So let's get one of these tiny screws and just place it right there. Haha, foolproof. Okay. Get the base plate and move the screw ever so gently and just twist it right in. Okay, and most of these are now done. Let's go ahead and screw in those last two. Problem is you have to apply enough force so that the threads catch. Otherwise they just, it'll just, ow! And look what we have here. We have the iFlight Sussex F4 stat. Oh, whoop! I don't think that's supposed to happen. Okay, I'm pretty sure it goes on like that, or maybe, oh wait a minute, there's like two holes right here. It looks like it fits just right, or maybe just barely fits. Hold on, it's kind of weird. It's like it was designed to fit through these two holes, but it's just barely. Maybe if I force it, it should be fine, right? And that brings us to where we are today. So with what we have in front of us here instead is what is known as a Toothpick. It's basically a light, high thrust to weight ratio build that capitalizes on performance at the cost of reduced real estate. You're pretty limited on the number of components you can throw into this. So with that said, let's go over the components here. First up, we're going to be using the EMAX 1404 6000 kV motors. These are nice for the frame since 1404s generally have the required 9mm mounting pattern while still having the punch of a large motor. The receiver we're using for this build is the FrSky R-XSR SBUS mini receiver. This is what allows our remote control to tell the quad what to do. We're using the HQ prop, T3 by 1.5 by 3 tri-blade props. For the VTX or video transmission antenna, we're using a right-hand circular polarized antenna or RHCP antenna from Lumiere. The camera housing is the BETAFPV canopy used for their X-Night toothpicks. The camera is a Caddx Ratel Starlight, and additionally, I've added camera standoff mounts to be used as antenna protector holders to mimic what is seen on the BETAFPV's X-Night toothpicks. The VTX is a NAMELESSRC D400 VTX+DVR AIO, or all-in-one. This will allow me to record my flights at 720p onto an onboard 32GB SanDisk microSD. The flight controller is a BETAFPV Toothpick F4 12A AIO flight controller and ESC combo. And finally, for the frame, I've decided to use FPV's TP3 or Toothpick 3-inch frame. This is an awesome frame designed to allow individual parts to be replaced in the event of something inevitably breaking, while also keeping the frame and build as light as possible. And for the battery, we're going to be using a TATTU R-Line 450 mAh 2S Lipo battery with an XT30 connector. First things first, let's go ahead and grab the top plate of the TP3, and if you notice, I've already screwed in the mounting screws for this. These were kind of a pain in the butt to get in place, so I figured I'd just do this off camera because the process by itself is pretty straightforward. Now we'll go ahead and grab the bottom plate and begin mounting the arms onto the bottom plate. Now, if you notice, there are two sides, go figure two, to the plate. This side that has the little indent for the center screw, this is the bottom of the bottom plate. This is not the side you want the arms on. Instead, we'll flip it over and begin mounting the arms by inserting a screw into each of the four corners and putting each arm onto those screws. Now, if you notice, each of the arms actually have a puzzle-like shape on the inside side of each piece. So you want to make sure they're all oriented the same way. So you don't want to put it in like this because it won't fit. You need to flip it over and make sure it's inserted the correct direction. Alright, and with the four corner screws in place, let's go ahead and grab the remaining center screw and insert it into the little divot here in the back. Once again, it's shaped just the right way for this type of screws. That's how you know you're putting it in the correct direction, along with the other screws. So let's go ahead and just insert that into the center, and then we'll take the top plate and sandwich the arms in between the top and bottom plates. Now, what you'll notice as we put the top plate in place is that it has these four black circles on each corner and the center of its piece, and those are essentially nuts that are built into the top plate. So all you have to do is line up the screws and then tighten them into those built-in nuts. And also I dropped this flathead, so And that is the TP3 frame fully assembled. Now, if you notice, in addition to these mounting screws I've already placed in a 25 by 25 configuration, or whoop style configuration, there's also these additional four 20 by 20 mounting holes. Now, as far as I'm aware, these were not always available on the TP3 frame. It was only in, I think, the most latest iteration of this build. So just keep in mind, you have that option for mounting 20 by 20 flight controllers. Now, before we continue on, I just wanted to mention really quick, on the flight controller, I've already went ahead and pre-soldered a lot of the pads here. So as you can see, I've pre-soldered the motors here. I've also pre-soldered the VTX pads here, the receiver pads here, the LED 5V ground pads here. Yeah, it just really makes it easy to attach all those components when the time comes. Also, this XT30 power cable was already added onto the flight controller by BETAFPV. It also has this nifty little capacitor built into the plug as well. In addition to that, they also provide these awesome clear white, what are they called, like grommets that you can add to the boards. So you just simply put in the hole and just kind of stuff it in there. And it's there so that you can get a nice vibration reduction in the flight controller. So when the motors are spinning, it doesn't affect it as much as you're flying through the air. And now we'll go ahead and take the flight controller and try to figure out how we want to mount it onto the TP3. The way I've decided to do it is, as you can see, the BETAFPV logo is there at the top, and so are motors 1 and 2. So I just assumed this was the front of the controller. Maybe that's not the case. I can't be sure, but that's what I went with. So now, how I want to mount it to the TP3 frame is I'm going to assume that this arrow-shaped rubber band holder that's meant for holding your battery in place, I'm going to assume that's the front of the frame just because it looks like an arrow, and I'll just mount it just like that onto the frame. Alright, with that in place, now this gives us an opportunity to figure out what the heck we want to do with these motor wires, because as you can see, these wires are extremely long. So first I'm going to go ahead and mount the motor to the arm of the frame. That way it's in place and in a position where I can properly measure out the length of wires and figure out if I want to cut the wires or if I want to route them some way around the board so that I use the full length of them without having to cut them. And as you can see, I went ahead and mounted all 4 motors onto the arms, and so I'm just kind of playing around with some ideas of how I want to route this wire to reach those pads. So this is my initial idea. I just wanted to kind of wrap it around the arm it's sitting on, tuck it underneath the flight controller, and bring it back over and around, and then just kind of solder it into place there. So I think this is probably going to be the best way to go, so I don't have to force myself to cut the wires in the event I want to use them on, for example, another build. Alright, and I've went ahead and routed the wires the way I showed before, so now I'm going to just simply pre-solder each wire tip. That way when I go to solder them onto the actual pad, the solder that's already on the pad just kind of gels together with the wire and it's easily placed. Alright, and those motor wires are now soldered in place. Now I just need to figure out how I want to route the other motor wires around the ones that are already soldered on. So give me a minute to figure that out and I'll hopefully get back to you with a good result. And this is what I decided on. I've already soldered the remaining wires onto their respective pads, and I tucked in the rear motor wires underneath the front motor wires. Now the only issue here is making sure I don't cover up these other solder points for the VTX and the radio receiver. So I need to kind of play around with the wire positions so I clean this up a bit more so they stay out of the way for when I do more soldering. Alright, and this is going to have to work. I took electrical tape and wrapped it around all the individual arm wires so that they're held in place. That way I had a bit of slack with the wires that wouldn't budge. And I went ahead and kind of wrapped them around the mounting screws for the flight controller and kind of just pinched them together a little bit to tuck them away, and that kind of cleared up all these pads here. So I can now go ahead and start soldering on the VTX and FrSky receiver. And this is the FrSky receiver. This is the device that allows the radio transmitter to tell the quadcopter what to do. And out of these 5 wires, we're actually only going to be using 3. So we're going to be using the ground, the 5 volt, and the green SBUS wire. The other 2 we're just going to forget about. And if you look at the flight controller, the places where these things are going to go is actually very clearly marked. We can see G, 5V, and SBUS. That just simply stands for ground, 5 volt, and SBUS, or black, red, green. Now, on the FrSky receiver itself, if you notice, there's actually a tiny little button right here. That's the binding button. So what you want to do is you want to press and hold that as you plug in the battery while your radio transmitter, let me get rid of that, while the radio transmitter is in binding mode. That's how you bind this receiver to your controller. So just keep that in mind for later. But first, we're going to have to clip these wires so that they're not too long, because right now they are horrendously long. Alright, and the wires are now clipped, and I've went ahead and removed a bit of the rubber to reveal some of the wire at the top. That way I get a chance to pre-solder the tips just like I did with the motor wires. So we're going to go ahead and pre-solder each one of these so that they easily gel into place when I go and try to solder them onto their respective pads. And with the wire pre-soldering complete, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the wires from the receiver so it makes it a bit easier to move the wires into place and solder the wires onto the board. And with the FrSky receiver soldered into place, let's go ahead and do the same thing except for the VTX wires. Similar to the FrSky receiver, there is a red and black, which are used for 5 volt and ground respectively. But in addition to that, there's also a white for flight controller TX, a yellow to flight controller video out, and finally a blue for flight controller video in. And then of course, red 5 volt and black ground. And with those mappings out of the way, we'll go ahead and solder those wires on. And with the magic of editing, the wires are now soldered. I actually completely forgot to record the process of soldering them, but there they are. And now it's as easy as plugging in the plug into the DVR VTX board, as well as into the camera. And now we have all the required electronics soldered onto the board, so now it's time to mount the VTX+DVR board on top of the flight controller board. To make things easier, let's go ahead and disconnect the camera first. And then we'll go ahead and take 3 rubber grommets and put those onto the mounting screws where the VTX is going to be placed. And now we'll go ahead and mount the VTX+DVR board. Just note that the UFL connector for the RHCP antenna is going to be facing the rear mounting screw. And now we'll take 3 nuts and secure the VTX+DVR board to the frame. And now we'll use one final nut to secure the flight controller to the one remaining mounting screw. With the VTX board now mounted, we'll go ahead and take the camera plug and wind that up so it's as short as possible and go ahead and connect it to the camera. And we'll wind up the remaining wire. From here, we'll take the canopy and insert the FrSky receiver antennas into the appropriate slot so that they fit into the antenna protectors. Now, one thing you can help with this part is you can remove the end cap off the protector so you can see the antenna poking through. Now note, you don't want the antenna to be poking like way beyond the protector. In fact, you want it to be basically flush with the protector. You don't want it to be sticking out at all. So go ahead and pull back on the antenna so only the very tip of it is barely showing out the top. With the antennas now in place, go ahead and take the camera and place it into the canopy and secure it using the mounting screws. Now, something to keep in mind while you're tightening the mounting screws is you want them tight enough so that the camera doesn't change its position while you're flying, but you also don't want it so tight that you can't manually move it yourself in the event that you want to change the camera angle. And now we'll just try to fit the FrSky receiver at just some kind of good spot on top of the VTX board. You don't want it to be directly on the VTX board because depending on what milliwatt setting you set it to, it can get pretty hot. So just put it somewhere in front of the VTX board since there's an open slot there, since the VTX board is more of a triangle than it is a square. And finally, we'll cap everything off with a canopy and secure it onto the frame using the mounting screws in the appropriate holes underneath the canopy. And just to double check that the canopy is secure, we'll go ahead and tug on the different mounting points and just make sure there's no wiggling and that it's actually truly secure. And now we're going to go ahead and put the antenna protector caps back on. And finally finish off the core part of the build by inserting and connecting the RHCP antenna. With the core piece fully assembled, we are now moving on to a debated topic: props in or props out. Now, I'm not going to go into this topic and explain what is what and all the benefits. There are plenty of videos online. I'm going to go ahead and link a couple of my favorite ones in the description below. Just know that at the very end, even though right now I'm mounting them for props in, I ultimately decided to go with props out configuration. And now it's just a matter of securing the props to their motors. And just like that, we now have our first fully assembled quadcopter. So now we'll go ahead and take it and bind it to our radio transmitter. Hey guys, so this is in post-editing to VOS. I just realized I left out kind of an important step, probably the most important step you could ever do, and that is how to secure the battery to the frame using a rubber band. So first off, let's go ahead and take the rubber band and just place it right here on that front bracket on the bottom side of the bottom plate. It's that little arrow piece I was using as guidance for the front of the airframe. And just take the rubber band and place it on both hooks. Then once you have it secured to the front, stretch it out and twist it a couple times. Once you have it twisted, go ahead and hook it onto that back T-piece. And just like that, you've got a rubber band that is used for holding your battery to the bottom of your quadcopter. And finally, with that vital piece of important information out of the way, let's go ahead and continue on to binding the quadcopter to your radio transmitter. All right, so first up, we're going to go ahead and start paging over to our, actually, let's access our profile first, then start paging over, and scroll down until we reach the binding portion of our transmitter. Once you reach that, we'll go ahead and select it and enter binding mode. You'll know you're in binding mode when you hear the beeping. So now that we are in binding mode, we'll go ahead and hold down that tiny little button I mentioned earlier that's on the FrSky receiver. Just click it and hold it down, and then while you're holding it down, plug in the battery. And after waiting a couple seconds, we'll go ahead and let go of the button, and then we'll double check that the transmitter is indeed connected by disconnecting the battery, and then reconnecting it and double checking to make sure the transmitter is receiving a signal from the FrSky receiver. And there it is. We can see that we got full bars, and we are good to go with the binding. With everything finally set up, we will now take our quadcopter over to the PC and set it up using Betaflight. Alright, we're here at the PC, so let's go ahead and take our USB cable and plug it into the USB port, and we should see some lights light up on the flight controller. Oh, and okay, that's weird. Maybe it needs a battery source or a power source. So let me plug in the battery. Then we should hear some beeps. Yep, there's... Oh, that's weird. Duh, duh. I was expecting that sound, but that didn't... What the heck? Alright, so... Good news. I have a working quadcopter. This guy is able to arm, turn on, it can take off, and blah, blah, blah. I can control it. Bad news. It's been about 5 hours since that last clip you saw. This has been some of the most excruciating troubleshooting ventures I've had in a long time. And just to, I mean, I don't want to put you guys through the whole thing, but it basically boils down to two major issues that came up. The first one, as you saw in the previous clip, the USB connection was not detecting anything. I plug in the USB, and there was no sound coming from the computer saying, "Doot, device has been plugged in." Nothing. It wasn't responding at all. Additionally, if you plug in a battery into the battery port here, the flight controller or whatever is playing a sound, or maybe it's an ESC, where it goes doot doot doot. After that, what should play is a doot doot. And I've asked people online, they say it's something to detect the throttle setting, that I think that it's connected and it's at 0, but that wasn't playing for some reason. And my biggest fear was that the flight controller was busted. So I freaked out. I spent like a good hour researching things online, asking people online, hey, these are my symptoms. What do you think the issue is? And ultimately, I got a response from FPV actually, and he said that, I never really had that issue happen, and what I would recommend is you go ahead and make sure there's no like random bits of solder on the flight controller that may have crossed and caused a what is it called? A short circuit. So unfortunately, I was already dreading, because I assume if it's a problem with the flight controller, like it's been busted, then I'm going to be desoldering everything anyway. So I took the whole thing apart, desoldered everything, and just to do a final check, just to make sure the flight controller was officially dead, with no components attached to it. It was just a flight controller. I plugged in the USB, and guess what started responding? So the flight controller luckily wasn't busted. It was just my crappy soldering job, and I caused a short circuit somewhere. So I very carefully resoldered all the components back together, all the motors, the flight controller, the VTX, the FrSky receiver. Everything was soldered back into place, and then I plugged in the USB, and it worked like a charm. I was able to connect it to the PC, and I was able to configure it using Betaflight. So success! Now, I said there was two major problems. That was the first one. Now the second one. And it has to do with the motor arrangement, or I think more specifically, it has to do with the orientation of the flight controller. If you notice, back when I was first setting this up and deciding what orientation to put the flight controller on the frame, I decided to use the word BETAFPV as the indicator that that was the front of the flight controller. Apparently, that is not correct, because based on the flight controller, there are numbers on the face of it that says this is motor 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So think of it as like a reverse Z. So a Z would be like this. It's a reverse Z. 1, 2, 3, 4. In beta flight, it's expecting the motors to be like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So as you can see, that's quite a bit different. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Instead, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I did a bunch of troubleshooting trying to figure out, okay, maybe I need to remap the motors and resources so that when I input like left, right, up, down, or throttle, it knows which motor is the correct one. So I just have to remap everything. So Betafly says when it wants to spin up motor 2, I need to tell it to translate that into motor 1 on the flight controller so that it does the appropriate action depending on what I'm doing here. So, but it wasn't that complicated, because if you take this and keep in mind, again, this is 1, 2, 3, 4. Look at the picture on the right. All I have to do is rotate it negative 90 degrees and suddenly everything matches. So that's all that was. Freaking A. Literally hours and hours of troubleshooting. Okay, well, anyways, done with the rant. It's been like 5 minutes or something. That was everything I did. I'm not going to show you the Betaflight configuration. All you need to know is that it's been set up properly. If you guys want to know how to configure something in Betaflight, there's plenty of videos online to show you how to do it. So just know I got to figure it out. This sucker's flying, and it's time for my first real flight. Alright, this is the first flight test, just to make sure it's working, and just fly it around for a bit and make sure I'm actually used to flying these things. Yeah, I wasn't ready yet. Oh yeah, now we're ready. In closing, everything from the hours of research, watching an endless supply of helpful tutorials and flying videos from the likes of Joshua Bardwell, Mr. Steele, Mute FPV, Nurk FPV, Kebab FPV, and learning just how many blah FPV channels there are. Seriously guys, everything was a blast from beginning to crashing. Now, that said, FPV isn't for everyone. Just like with any hobby, there's a cost to entry whether you buy a ready-to-fly kit or build your own drone for yourself. Not only that though, there will always be some technical hurdles to overcome. But if you have the willingness to learn and perseverance to overcome challenges, and some spare funds available, this is a great hobby to get into. From start to finish, this has been a great ride. Though I guess I should say this isn't really the end, but still really only the beginning for me. And I hope now this is your beginning too. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like. And if you really liked it and would like to see more of this kind of stuff, please let me know in the comments and subscribe for more. Take care guys, have a nice day. Oh, and special thanks to Bad Dashins, Rafiki, Kebab FPV, and the folks over at Joshua Bardwell's Discord channel for helping me out with all this.